Hi everyone, this is Asperger again. This time I'm talking about the way my sensory processing disorder and OCD affect me, and the times when they interweave between each other and how difficult it is to tell what is my sensory issues and what is OCD. It took me a while to get this section in order because there are so many instances and I really don't believe I've gathered them all together even now. I've been affected by sensory processing disorder for as long as I can remember. I was unaware as to what I was experiencing since I had no friends to turn to about what I was going through. I'm affected by hypersensitivity, which means I am overly sensitive and defensive of sensory experiences. I can remember when I was in secondary school, when a student asked to borrow a protractor. He jammed it into his mouth at one point, and when he gave it back to me, I couldn't touch it with my bare hands. I had to knock it into my rucksack, and I swore never to touch it again. It was only through this action that someone noticed that I may have Asperger syndrome, and that was around the same time as my breakdown. It took them all that time to notice that I was on the spectrum, and the person that noticed was a special needs teacher. Is it any wonder why I was so misunderstood by the teachers around me? I hated PE for many reasons, most of which involved my sensory issues and OCD. When we wore shorts in PE, I was constantly in fear of someone else's bare legs touching mine when we sat down to listen to the teacher. In secondary school, my mother had to write a note to the PE teacher to inform him that I couldn't participate in PE out on the grass. This was due to the fact that I couldn't stand falling over in wet mud. This is one such example of where my sensory issues and OCD interweave themselves. I hated both the feeling of getting dirt on my skin and the fact that I was getting dirty. I was affected by both instances. On the subject of PE, my hatred of PE was long-running. I can remember having difficulty learning how to swim. I couldn't no matter what I did. And you know what the PE teacher in primary school thought was the best thing to do? Shout at me. Yes, shouting at me was really going to help me learn how to swim, wasn't it? This is yet another example of the lack of understanding I received from school. I learned how to swim much later with the help of a private tutor, but I'm still not a confident swimmer. I can hold my breath underwater to reach for something at the bottom of the surface, but I can only see with goggles. I was always afraid of getting water in my eyes, even to this day, but I've improved a lot since the early days. I can remember when I was really young, when I had my hair washed, I used to scream so loud the neighbours must have thought there was a murder going on. Seriously though, it took a long time before I could wash my hair confidently without the fear of water getting into my eyes. I can remember the awful times I had during school dinners. I mainly stuck to pack lunches. It was only towards the last stages of secondary school before I left due to my breakdown that I moved to eating the pizza and chips there, since I couldn't see anything that was appealing that I could eat safely in that environment. When I was in secondary school, I took one look at the cauldrons of whatever brown muck was floating and the disgusting smell, and it made queuing up for food become a grueling prospect. My worst time at school was in primary school at Christmas. They expected you to eat the Christmas dinner. I took one look at the plate with all those vegetables touching each other, and I thought, there's no way in the world I can eat this. I felt embarrassed that I couldn't eat it, and I told them I couldn't, but they couldn't understand why, and I began to cry since they didn't understand and I didn't know how to explain myself. It was awful. My worst time growing up with my sensory issues in food was when I went to my rock friend's house just before our friendship was broken up. I call him my rock friend because I could hardly get a word out of him throughout our friendship. The only thing I could say that he was a defense against bullies. As long as he was there, I was immune. Anyway, my mother spoke to his father and stepmother, telling them that I couldn't eat certain meat, including chicken, and I had to eat food on separate plates. I can remember when I went over to their house, there was an immediate change in atmosphere which made me very uncomfortable. It was so strange. I could sense there was a complete air of control written all over the place, and it only became more evident as the time passed. I went into my rock friend's room, and I asked him if we could play on his PlayStation, but he said he could only do that on a weekend, and even then only for an hour or so. I looked at him and thought, that's harsh, so I said, is there anything we can play? I can't remember if he said no or just stared at me, but he gave me this signature reaction, these watery eyes. It was really bugging me. I couldn't understand at the time why he kept giving me them. But now I'm sure it's got a lot to do with that controlling air I noticed. We were barely in there for a minute before we were called to eat, which I thought was a bit strange. I thought, why so early? My friend's father told him to go to the local shops to get some chips from the fish and chip shop, which he did. In that time, I felt very rigid and uncomfortable. When he came back, the stepmother began cooking, and then when the food came, I looked at it and was immediately shocked. What did I see on the plate? It was chicken, peas, and chips, and they were all touching. Not only did I not like chicken, I was unsure about peas as well, but even though I could eat chips, they were touching the chicken. It was a sensory nightmare, and what made it worse is that they knew I couldn't eat that, but they served it anyway. There was clearly something wrong with what was going on there. I just froze. I was in a very awkward position. I just stared at the food, since I couldn't look up, and said, I can't eat this. Whereby the father just said, can't you just eat the chips? I have sensory issues. Of course I couldn't, as they were touching the chicken and peas. I just said, no, whereby the stepmother ran off into the kitchen and began crying, and the father went after her. I just stared at my friend, and he looked at me with those watery eyes again. I felt so stiff and rigid. I didn't know what to do. I felt so uncomfortable. The father then suggested that he take me home, which he did. Mum found out by confronting the teacher that the next day his father came into the school to suggest he and I be split up in the classroom. I was then right in front of the class, completely alone, and that started another long story, not to mention a critical bullying incident. It really shook me up what happened around that friend's house, and I've never forgotten it, particularly that controlling, stuffy feeling. In the last year of primary school, we had to shake our hands with the head teacher of the school and receive a dictionary in the other hand. Despite being aware of this, it was the first time I noticed my difficulty with shaking someone's hand. I knew I couldn't stand other people's knees touching mine, but I didn't realize the effect a hand would have. As we shook hands, I immediately felt discomfort. There was a strong tingling sensation that felt awful. It's difficult to describe, but following that, I made sure I never shook anyone's hand again if I could help it. Now, the only way I could come close to shaking someone's hand is if I wore a double layer of cotton gloves, as the feeling is too strong. I also always carry a hand gel with me, just in case, to numb the feeling away. Again, this is a confliction between sensory issues and OCD. I find it difficult to differentiate between the two. When it comes to touch sensory issues, I can't even pull the strap over my shoulder in a car without the use of gloves, my shirt sleeve, my coat sleeve, etc. It's the same indoors as well, but when I'm indoors, I tend to use my shirt sleeve more than my gloves. I don't like the feeling of foreign surfaces because they are unfamiliar with me. I honestly can't tell you what is causing their sensory issues or OCD. I believe it's difficult to tell the difference between the two sometimes. I could never go into someone else's shower or bath. I can remember being offered to go into my grandmother's shower a few times, and there is no way in the world I could have done that. I cannot go into a shower or bath that is different to the one at home. Even then, I have to take certain procedures before I feel safe to have a shower. Other people think, have a shower, it'll make you feel better. But you know, there is so much routine involved, it becomes too much of a chore to be anything else. This has a lot to do with my OCD, but it can cross over with my sensory issues at the same time. I have eyes like a hawk when it comes to the hairs and grime in the bath. I have to spend at least 10 to 30 minutes just holding the shower hose to spray anything away, anything I see lurking around before I feel comfortable. Then I have to place a bath towel at the bottom so that I can put my feet down without the worry about anything I've missed. When I had difficulty washing my hair due to water, I used to cover my forehead with my hand, but now I don't need to. When it comes to sound, well, I find people slurping their food irritating, especially when they lick their fingers. I cringe. I find it very difficult to concentrate on what someone is saying when there is a lot of commotion going on around me. It's difficult to cut the world off and just circle on the person in front of you. I hate arguments, and on many occasions I've been known to cut off these sounds by listening to music with my earphones. You know, whoever invented earphones is a genius. All you have to do to avert an uncomfortable sound is to just plug them into your laptop, MP3 or whatever, and then this world around you is quiet, if only for a moment. Unless, of course, the sound is louder than the music, in which case you're in trouble. Other than that, though, it's the best way I've found to cut the world off when it's just driving you crazy. I found it very difficult to attempt to go to the opticians to check my eyesight when I needed glasses, and it took a lot of effort and the opticians making it more comfortable before I could get my eyes tested. In general, the higher my anxiety, the more my sensory issues and OCD affect me. You have no idea what I have to go through to even make breakfast or any other meal. When I take a plate, bowl, saucer, whatever, I take a long look at it, and if I see anything out of place, I have to wash it until it's spotless. This goes for any cutlery or surface I work on as well. It's so difficult just to make a simple breakfast because of the amount of time it takes. When it comes to food, well, for a start off, I'm a vegetarian. This started a long time ago while I was eating burgers at a fast food restaurant. In the middle of eating the burger, I suddenly started feeling this tough stringiness inside, and it felt very unpleasant. I immediately put the burger down, cringed, and thought, there's no way I can eat this. I didn't become a vegetarian straight away. At first, I felt that I could only eat meat if it was covered by a bun, like a hot dog, and I eventually began trying burgers again. I used to eat salami, but that was off the menu for good. I never ate a lot of meat, though. I didn't eat bacon, chicken, or anything like that. Besides, I hate the smell of both of them. I believe most meat smells foul, both then and now. Anyway, it wasn't long after that I went back into that fast food restaurant, and could feel that tough stringiness again. That's when I suddenly got a picture of a cow and its young, and that was the last straw. I couldn't possibly eat another animal. It was like I was eating someone's mother or father. From then on, I've been vegetarian, and I've been looking at everything from the ingredients in everyday food items and vitamins to see if I can spot any animal products. When it comes to foods in general, food has to pass 3 tests before I feel comfortable about eating something. I need to find out how it looks, feels, and tastes like. I was never able to eat food on the same plate. They'd have to be on separate plates. I can remember when I used to eat certain vegetables around my grandmother's. I ate these homemade butter puddings she made. I used to have them with the gravy, but it was long before I could only eat. But it wasn't long before I could only eat the butter puddings themselves, and then I was put off by the vegetables altogether. Even now, when I eat vegetables, I have to scrutinize every vegetable to see if there's anything that puts me off. I can't stand the brown specks I notice on the surfaces. That's an immediate turn-off. When it comes down to specific fruit and vegetables, I've always hated mushrooms since I've always observed them as fleshy overgrowths. I can't stand courgettes because they are far too crunchy, which reminds me, I can only eat carrots when they are soft. I can't stand it when they are crunchy either. I can't stand potatoes with eyes. I used to put them off altogether, then I only accepted those with only partial growth. Now I can't stand them altogether since I've noticed this black inside the potato. I find bananas and mangoes too fleshy, pears too grainy, raspberries and blackberries too hairy and mushy, pomegranates and kiwis too sour. I've discovered that I can cope with watermelon and most melons unless they taste a bit sour. I can only cope with strawberries if they are covered with either sugar or cream, as they are far too sour on their own. I can also just cope with apples, but I get concerned when they turn brown, so I try to eat them quickly to stop that from happening. As I eat tomatoes in pizzas, pastas, soups, and in the past tomato ketchup, it wasn't that difficult to eat whole tomatoes. They were a little fleshy at first, but they're not too bad. Mind you, I think that certain tomatoes have a better flavor than others. Not so long ago, I was converted to spring onions. Mind you, I'm not 100% safe with them. I've looked from the top of them and I can notice this black powdery substance and have to chop the end off before I eat it. Not to mention I have to make sure I check that the outer skin doesn't look a little discolored, because if it is, I unpeel a layer. Then, last of all, I give them all a second rinse. I've tried celery. I don't mind the flavor, but I find it too stringy. I'm fine with cucumber though, mind you. I find the skin a bit irritating, so I take the skin off. I've been wanting to try new foods for a while now, but it doesn't always go well. When my mother tried to make vegetable chili con carne for me to try, I gave it a few mouthfuls. I couldn't stand it, as it was too lumpy. It was becoming a chore with every mouthful. When it comes to pizzas, in the early days, I could only cope with margarita pizzas. Eventually, I started to want to try different toppings to see what it was like. I tried chilies and jalapenos, since I love spicy food. Then I eventually moved on to one of the pizzas in the menu, the spicy vegetarian variety with no mushrooms, and I've been able to cope with them. There are elements where I'm both hypersensitive to food and hyposensitive to food. One good example of how hypersensitive I am to food is pineapples. As I'm slowly trying new foods, I decided a few years ago to attempt eating some pineapple. The first few bites were passable. The flavor was nice, but the stringiness was a bit irritating. Then, all of a sudden, after a few bites, this huge wave came over me. The taste became overwhelmed with a strong, tangy sourness. I immediately started cringing. I tried to finish it, but I was only taking one small bite at a time. One good example of how hyposensitive I am to food is in the amount and variety of spices I add to food. For a long time now, I've kept an array of all sorts of spices, from chili powder, chili flakes, dried bird's eye chilies, black pepper, spicy sauces, and many more. I've had difficulty in knowing where to put them all. I now keep them in a box beside me as I'm eating. I can remember I used to have this spice I obtained from a supermarket, but they constantly keep changing their products and I've been unable to find it again. I've been searching around to find an alternative and it took some time, but I've finally found something that's as close as I think I'm going to get. I'm sure you can imagine how much all these spices must mask the flavor of what I eat, but personally, I believe it adds flavor to bland food. The most bland foods I can remember eating were microwave rice. In the end, they all started to taste the same as each other, and baked beans. Even when I add my spices, it becomes a chore to finish them. I also have a certain routine when it comes to how I add my spices to pizzas. I put different variations of spices on each slice. I keep my favorite to the largest slices and my least favorite to the smallest. I do that because to me it feels like I'm eating something different with each mouthful. One food I have absolutely no difficulty with, as long as it's soft, is fresh bread. I can always remember when I was in primary school, my mother used to buy some fresh rolls down at the local shops. I can always remember the smell. It was always so inviting. Then, when I bite into them, it was like I was biting into clouds. Even now, I still love the texture of fresh soft rolls and its inviting aroma. When it comes to smell, I can remember when I was in school, we had to go to a supermarket and write down certain information about the items we found on the shelves. I can remember the different smells that carried from each aisle. Some I preferred more than others. I loved the smell of the coffee, fresh bread, candles, and, strangely enough, washing powder, each of which carried their own attracting aroma. The aisle I couldn't stand was the pet food. That had an awful smell, and I wanted to stay as far away from it as possible. Anyway, that's it for now, and thank you for listening.